I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which the Australia-based participants of the workshop are gathered today, and pay my respect to elders past and present. I am Tina Rampino, and I am based at the Centres for the Business and Economics of Health at the University of Queensland. I am also a member of the Women in Economics Network Queensland Committee and the founder and manager of the WEN Queensland Mentoring Program. On behalf of the Women in Economics Network, I would like to welcome everyone to the second keynote lecture of the fourth edition of the Australian Gender Economics Workshop. This session is going to last 1 hour, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the presentation of our speaker or at the end of it. And Lata will kindly address your questions once she's done presenting her findings. At the end of this session, we're going to have our networking session straight after it. So we will be directed into it straight away. Stay tuned to connect with your colleagues. Let me say a couple of words about Lata before she can start her presentation. So Lata Gangadharan received her PhD in 1998 from the University of Southern California. She's a professor of economics and Joe Isaac Chair of Business and Economics at Monash University. She's an experimental and behavioral economist, and a key focus of her research has been on developing novel experimental methods, both in the lab and in the field, to study economic and social institutions. Her recent research focuses on incentives and preferences and addresses a wide range of topics, including, but not limited to gender and social identity. Now, every time I have the chance and the honor to introduce someone speaking at a WEN event, I take the liberty of asking them about mentoring. Lata told me that she was very lucky to have two very supportive men supervisors during her PhD, but she also stressed how important her peer network has been for her progression, both personally and professionally. She's also told me that she has been and she will continue to mentor junior economists, both men and women. And this is very important for the network, as WEN was the seed for WEN was planted through mentoring activities. So we are really glad to hear people we engage with value this activity. Today, Lata will be sharing her insights on the role gender plays in decision making. So with no further ado, Lata, the screen or floor is yours.
Thank you, Tina. Thanks so much for the very generous introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'd like to thank all the organizers for inviting me and putting together such a nice workshop, especially in such a challenging year. So yeah, thanks a lot for all your work that you have done in putting this workshop together. So as Tina mentioned, I'm going to talk today about evaluating decision makers. Does gender matter? Differences in economic decisions, labor market outcomes, and the agency of women and men have been widely documented. For example, women earn less than men, leading to lower lifetime earnings. They're also not involved in the decision-making process much and are less likely to be found in leadership positions. There are many possible explanations for these differences. One of them revolves around the differences in preferences. That is, women are often seen to be more risk-averse, they're seen to be less competitive and less confident. However, there are other reasons as well, such as the differential evaluation that they face. So women may be less likely to be selected as decision makers because they're often constrained by others' perceptions, beliefs, and stereotypes about them. Decision-making does not exist in a vacuum, so the social and the institutional environment can be quite important, and environments that are male-dominated may be more susceptible to stereotypes. There's a rich literature now which examines these different explanations, so much so that now we also have some really nice survey papers on the topic. And here is a list of some survey papers. Each of them focuses on a specific issue in this area. For example, Crossan and Gnizzi focus on preferences. Nedderly focuses on differences in competitive preferences. Bertrand and Duflo examine discrimination and taste-based and statistical discrimination. Blau and Kahn have a very nice survey which documents the papers that use observational data on this topic. Hernandez, Arenas, and Iribiri focus on negotiation and gender differences in that. And in the last paper is one that one is one that I had opportunity to co-author with Catherine Eckel, Phil Grossman, and a student of ours, Nina Shu. And there we focus on gender and leadership. So the focus today is going to be on evaluation of decision makers. And we know from research done using both experiments and observational data that there are gender biases that are observed in the evaluation process across a variety of domains and contexts. For example, in the context of labor markets, in the case of market for doctors or the market for financial advisors, you see gender biases appearing. In the context of entrepreneurship, in the context of academics, science, and also while hiring musicians in the symphony orchestra. Let me just elaborate a bit on the papers that deal with academics. Both these papers actually focus on publications in economics, and what Sarsens et al. Find is that women get less credit for co-authored publications as compared to men. Hengel finds that female authored papers spend 6 months longer in the review process, and these papers are also they have tougher standards which are imposed on them. So this is obviously too close for comfort for us, and obviously some of you here may have had experiences which are similar. The aim today is to share insights from 2 projects. In the first project, we would be examining the evaluation of female and male decision makers, and this evaluation is going to take place by group members. So we'll have a setup where decision makers are going to take actions, but these actions are going to be made under uncertainty. These actions can lead to good or bad outcomes, but because the evaluators, who are the group members in this case, cannot observe the actions of the decision maker, they have to form some beliefs about these actions. So we are going to be studying the role of biased beliefs and outcome bias in performance evaluation. The second project examines, again, evaluation of male and female decision makers, but in this case, we're going to focus on third-party evaluation. And here our interest would be to look at situations where both men and women violate norms, and this would be the norm of equal distribution in this case, and we'll be interested in examining who are the ones who get punished for these transgressions. Is there a gender differential there? And also, what is the role of the social environment in how these punishments take place? So in addition to both these projects focusing on evaluation of male and female decision makers, the other common aspect across these projects is that decision makers in both these projects face a choice to be pro-social. And of course, the other commonality across these projects is that both use experimental and behavioral methods, which can be actually quite useful to try and understand gender and evaluation issues. And one of the reasons why this is so is because preferences and beliefs can be more precisely measured using experiments as compared to other empirical methods. Similarly, information about critical variables, such as the information evaluators have about decision makers, how informative are the naturally occurring signals, and how reliable is the data on prior and posterior beliefs, all of these would be much easier to obtain using experiments. Also in experiments, the gender of the decision maker can be varied, and this can be really helpful because this can help us in obtaining causal estimates. It can be easier in experiments to define appropriate counterfactual treatments. Consider a situation where the researcher is using observational data to understand, gender and decision making. One of the issues that they may face is that if they're using observational data, they might not be able to find enough data about female decision makers because there are not many female decision makers in the field. But with experiments, what one can do is to define comparison groups and control groups more accurately. It can be also easier to observe counterfactual decisions, and this is more so in lab experiments and lab in the field experiments, where you can collect data for each possible node or in the action set or the information set, and this can be done using the strategy method, for example. And I guess because of so many different reasons, many researchers are now incorporating experimental methods in their research, and that brings me to the first project that I want to talk to you about. So this is about gender biases and performance evaluation. Do outcomes matter more than intentions? And this is joint work with Nishwan Urkel, who's at the University of Melbourne, and Boon Han Ko, who's at University of East Anglia. Now, many economic transactions are characterized by actions which are not perfectly observable. So when actions are not perfectly observable, then one ends up forming beliefs about these actions. And in the process of this belief formation, what happens is that some biases might emerge. And that was the topic of our previous work. That was the subject of our previous work in this area, where we found that yes, beliefs can be biased, and these biased beliefs can influence performance evaluation. When you have an uncertain environment, outcomes which you can observe, these outcomes can act as signals. However, the issue is that in addition to outcomes acting as signals, these outcomes can also have a direct effect on performance evaluation. For example, researchers have found that CEOs and politicians are rewarded or punished depending on factors which are outside their control. So the outcomes seem to matter more than their actual actions. So what we're going to be focusing on in this paper is whether there are gender biases in the weights that are placed on beliefs, which is this, versus outcomes. So our aim is to shed light on these different kinds of gender biases. Are there biases in prior beliefs and updating, which we refer to as a gender inference gap? And are there biases in weights which are put on beliefs versus outcomes, which we call the gender intention outcome gap? So what we do in this paper is we have a setup where decision makers are going to make costly and unobserved effort choices, and these are going to be on behalf of a group. The outcomes of the decision maker are determined by a combination of what they choose and luck. The group members evaluate the performance of the decision maker and decide to make discretionary payments, which are basically like bonuses and penalties. So we're going to use a theoretical framework where the decision makers can be compensated both for their intentions, which is basically the beliefs that the group members have about the actions taken by the decision maker, and the actual outcomes of the decision maker. And we follow some insights from the Fogg and Fish-Barker model, and I'll talk more about it in a little while. So the data from the experiments on prior and posterior beliefs help us in examining how evaluators update beliefs about decision maker based on their gender. And it also helps us in identifying the role of beliefs versus outcomes in determining these bonuses and penalties for men and women. So our research question, the overarching research question, is whether successes and failures of men and women are evaluated differently, and in particular, are there gender biases in the evaluators' beliefs about the choices made? Are there discretionary payments? Are these going to be determined by beliefs only or by both beliefs and outcomes? And does gender affect the role played by beliefs versus outcomes? So what is the weight placed on beliefs versus outcomes? So let me give you a quick overview of the experimental design, and then I'll show you the timing that we have in the experiment. So subjects in the experiment participate in an investment task, and they do this in groups of 3. And we use some design features that we have in our previous paper on attribution biases. The decision maker, whom I refer to here as DM, just for convenience. So the decision maker makes an unobservable investment, which in our case would be a high effort or a low effort. And this is going to affect the group members' payoffs. This investment can succeed. If it succeeds, it's a good outcome. If it fails, it's a bad outcome. high effort is more costly for the DM, but it's going to increase the probability that a good outcome occurs for the whole group. So the expected payoff is going to be higher for the DM if the DM puts in low effort, and it's higher for each group member if the DM puts in high effort. So you can see that there is a tension between these two options. Whether the DM should choose high effort or low effort is therefore going to be now determined by the altruism level of the DM. Members are going to state beliefs about the DM's decisions and choose whether to give the DM a bonus or a penalty. And this is not going to come at a personal cost to the member. So let me show you what they do. Subjects first make an effort decision as DM. So they all do that, and they have to choose whether they want to put in high effort or low effort. And as I said, high effort is more costly. Then they are put into groups of 3. The groups are formed such that half of the groups have a male decision maker and half of the groups have a female decision maker. And one of the 3 is a decision maker and the other 2 are group members. So the roles are assigned at this stage, and also the gender of the DM is revealed. So what we do is we ask all the participants to raise their hands when their group number is called, and we ask the DM to say here when their ID number is called. So this basically helps in revealing the gender of the decision maker to the group members. And after this stage, we also use the relevant gender pronouns when we are referring to the decision maker on their online screens. Members report prior and posterior beliefs on the likelihood that the DM will choose high effort. So the posterior beliefs are conditional on the outcomes, which can be good or bad. And we incentivize these beliefs, and these are incentivized using the binarized scoring rule, which basically is an incentive compatible mechanism, which is irrespective of the risk preferences of subjects, is going to be incentive compatible for them to reveal their true beliefs. The last stage is where the members are going to choose whether they would like to increase or decrease the DM's payoffs, and this is by giving them bonuses or penalties, and this would be also conditional on the good and the bad outcomes. So what I just described to you, that is basically the payoff adjustment treatment, where members state beliefs and choose whether to give the DM a bonus or a penalty. We also have another treatment where members only state their beliefs about the DM's decision, so there is no bonus or penalty decision that they make, and this is the no payoff adjustment treatment, which we refer to as NA. And the reason we have this treatment is because it helps us in isolating the biases in beliefs from other biases that can arise in our setting. Okay, and what are these other biases? Because in this case, where members can give bonuses or penalties, the DMs can change their behavior, and in anticipation, the members can also change how they, whether they think that the DM has put in high effort or not. So these kind of strategic interactions might be less so in this treatment. So we collect data on both these treatments, and we have data from 700 participants, and they earn on an average $40. So let me give you a bit of a flavor of the theoretical framework which underpins this project. We assume that the DM's effort choices are determined by their social preferences. So basically, DMs care about their own payoffs, but they also care about the payoffs of the members. And if DMs are sufficiently altruistic, and that's referred to by this alpha I here, then they're going to choose high effort so as to maximize expected utility. The components of their own payoff, these are listed here. So one of them is the output realized, which is then shared equally across the group. Omega, which is the initial endowment that the DM receives. And C is the cost of effort, and this is just borne by the DM. And delta is the bonus or the penalty that they may receive from the group member. So what do the members do in our case? The members, who are the evaluators of the DM, they hold prior beliefs about whether the DM has chosen high effort or low effort. And once they have observed the final outcome, they update their beliefs. And we assume that in theory, they are going to update their beliefs according to Bayes' rule, which basically says that their posterior beliefs would be a function of their prior beliefs and the signals that they see. The next decision they have to make is whether to give a discretionary payment. And we assume that these decisions are going to be motivated by reciprocity. And here we follow the work by Falk and Fischbacher, who suggest that for reciprocal actions, the intentions of the other agent, in addition to the outcomes, are also going to matter. So therefore, we consider a model of reciprocity where members' reciprocal actions are potentially determined by both their judgment of the DM's underlying intention and the consequence of the DM's action. So we think reciprocity is an important motivator here because in our experiment, we have a one-shot interaction. They don't get any feedback until the end of the experiment. So the payments that the DMs receive in terms of bonuses and penalties cannot really affect the future behavior of the DM. So reciprocity could be an important aspect here. So members in our case get utility from their material payoff as is usual, but they also get some utility from reciprocity, and that's what is indicated by this part of the equation. So the member is going to choose a bonus or a penalty to maximize the utility function given her reciprocity preferences, which is rho j here, and her perception of how kind the DM has been, which is phi I. Okay, so these are the aspects which are going to be important in our model. And just briefly, so phi I, which is member J's perception of how kind the DM is going to depend on two aspects. One of them is relating to outcomes and the other is relating to intentions. So let's suppose we have members who care only about the intentions of the DM, and the intentions of the DM are going to be captured by the posterior beliefs that the members hold about what the DM has done. Then these members who have maybe similar posterior beliefs will choose the same discretionary payment irrespective of what the outcome, because for them, the outcome does not matter. So this part does not matter at all. They only focus on this one. Now let's suppose that we have members who care only about the outcomes of the DM. That means it's this part of the equation that is important and this is not. So then the members are always going to reward good outcomes and punish bad outcomes irrespective of their beliefs. So this basically tells us that different people may be putting different weights on the outcomes versus the intentions. So delta, which is the bonus or the penalty, this can differ depending on the gender of the DM, because of the gender inference gap, that is, members update differently depending on the gender of the DM. And it can also depend on the gender intention outcome gap, because members may be putting different weights on intentions versus outcomes depending on the gender of the DM. Okay? So let me show you some results from this project. So let me start with the effort that the DM puts in and the prior beliefs of the evaluators. So we expect that we will find some treatment differences. So that is, the DMs are going to be more likely to choose high effort in treatment A as compared to treatment NA. And we also expect from the literature that female DMs might be more likely to choose high effort as compared to male DMs, because it is shown in the literature that women might be a little more altruistic as compared to men. Of course, this result is context specific, so we'll have to see what we find in our case. And prior beliefs are going to reflect these treatment and gender differences in effort choices. So let me show you some data on prior beliefs and effort. So this first graph is about effort, and this one is about prior beliefs. And you can see, indeed, we do find treatment differences. So effort is higher in treatment A, and prior beliefs are also higher in treatment A. Okay. In terms of gender differences, though, we don't find any gender differences. So members' prior beliefs are no different between male and female DMs. And they're also no different in their effort choices. Now let's move on to the posterior beliefs. So in terms of posterior beliefs, we expect that in both treatments A and NA, the outcomes of females are going to be more likely to be attributed to luck than those of males. And we base this on the literature in psychology on attribution biases and gender, which is actually quite nicely summarized by the phrase that they have, that he is skilled and she is lucky. So whenever there's a good outcome, what people believe is that he has put in a lot of effort and he's very skilled or smart, and she just got lucky. So the estimation strategy that we use here is that posterior beliefs are a function of prior beliefs and the signals, and we compare the estimates we get from that against the Bayesian benchmark. So let me just tell you what we find. In the treatment where there are no payoff adjustments, we do find attribution biases. So basically, we find that good outcomes of female DMs are attributed more to luck relative to Bayesian, while bad outcomes of male DMs are attributed more to effort. In the treatment where you have payoff adjustments, we don't find any attribution biases. And this was an interesting result to us, and we think there are some good reasons why this might be so. One of the reasons, for example, is that in this treatment, group members have more control because they have now the power to give out bonuses and penalties, but that also might mean that they feel more accountable or responsible, and they feel pressure to justify their decisions, and this can reduce biases. And this has been shown in other contexts by other authors. And I can talk more about it later, but in the interest of time, I should perhaps move on. In terms of discretionary payments, what do we find in this treatment? We don't find any attribution biases in this treatment, but what about the bonuses and penalties? So conditional on receiving a bonus, we find that female DMs receive lower bonuses on average for good outcomes. We also find that conditional on receiving a penalty, they receive a lower penalty on average for bad outcomes. Okay, so this is a slightly weaker result, and in regression analysis, this becomes less significant. Okay, so now when we started off, we were talking about this gender differences in discretionary payments, and we said that from the theoretical framework, we said that if we were to find gender differences in discretionary payments, this could be because of the gender inference gap or the gender intention outcome gap. So let's see what our data says about this. So here I'm showing you some graphs for the male DMs and the female DMs where we have plotted posterior beliefs against discretionary payment amount, which is the bonuses and the penalties. And the size of the bubble tells us how many observations we have here at each point. And these are fitted lines. These are fitted regression lines for the good outcomes and for the bad outcomes. So black is good outcome and red is bad outcome. So there are three main takeaways from this graph. What we find is that discretionary payments are higher for good outcomes than for bad outcomes, which is intuitive. But what is more interesting is that these payments are increasing in posterior beliefs for male DMs. So notice the upward sloping fitted lines here. And they do not depend on posterior beliefs for female DMs. So notice the flat lines here. Okay, so for male DMs, you can see that both beliefs and outcomes matter, but for female DMs, only outcomes matter. And also, the distance between the bad and the good outcome bonuses or penalties is much higher in the case of female DMs as compared to male DMs. Okay, so the outcomes matter more for female DMs as compared to male DMs. So we started off by asking what role do beliefs versus outcomes play in performance evaluation, and how does this vary by gender? What we find is that there is a gender inference gap in treatments where you cannot give a bonus or a penalty to the DM. And this is actually in our data driven by male evaluators. We don't find a gender inference gap in treatment A. That is where you have discretionary payments. What is, however, very interesting is that even though there is no gender inference gap, we still find a gender difference in bonuses and penalties. And we explain that using the gender intention outcome gap, because the determinants of discretionary payments for men and women seem to be different. And this gap is actually driven by female evaluators in our data. So while the outcomes matter for both men and women, the beliefs about intentions seem to matter only for men. And why is this important? Because men and women can receive different bonuses or penalties, even if evaluators hold the same beliefs about them. So if evaluators think that both male decision makers and female decision makers have put in high effort, this is only going to translate to a high bonus for men and not for women. Okay? In most organizations, accurate and objective signals of performance are not available. So people have to rely on subjective performance evaluation. But the problem is that this kind of evaluation is prone to biases. And what our results show from this project is that discrimination is not just about biased beliefs. We do see evidence of biased beliefs in our setting, but we also identify a new source of bias, which is the gender intention outcome gap. Importantly, good outcomes are necessary for women to get a bonus, but men can get a bonus for bad outcomes in our setting as long as the evaluators hold them in high regard. So In our setting, of course, we were interested in gender discrimination, but this kind of a framework can be used to understand discrimination along many other domains like race and religion, etc. So what is the way forward here in terms of what we can do to try and reduce some of these biases? Organizations may need to think of revising how subjective performance evaluation is carried out. In our data, what we find is that both male and female evaluators have biases. There may be different kinds of biases, but they both have biases. So replacing male evaluators with female evaluators may not necessarily be helpful. What we may instead want to think of is to have groups conducting evaluations where you have some diversity, not just perhaps in terms of gender, but at least in terms of gender, but also in terms of experience and different perception, different perspectives, etc. It might be also useful to think of a more structured approach where the whole weight is not on the final outcome, and there is more of a rubric and a well-defined way of evaluating people. Now let me take our collective attention to the second project that I would like to share with you. And the second project is about gender and third-party responses to transgressions. And this is joint work with Tarun Jain, who is at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, and with Pushkar Maitra, who is a colleague of mine at Monash. And we're going to go now from the lab to the field, because I'm going to report some results from field experiments in India. The reason we were interested in this project is because we were interested in situations where both men and women go against what is considered to be socially acceptable, but then maybe the way they're condemned or sanctioned is different according to gender. So think about the social or the cultural sphere where both men and women might be part of inter-race and inter-caste relationships, but maybe they are evaluated differently for being in these relationships. Think also of the economic sphere where women's aspirations to be in the labor force are seen to be less acceptable in many countries as compared to men's. And for women to work outside the house is seen to be, not really acceptable, and they're sanctioned more as compared to men, obviously. So we are going to be interested in this project in third-party evaluation. So who is a third party? A third party is basically somebody who is not monetarily affected by the actions of the decision maker. So they're not directly affected, they're not monetarily affected. So this third party in our context could be a village senior. And in extreme cases, sanctions could include violence against women. For example, there have been lots of incidences of honor killings in the regions that we're talking about. The focus in this project is on third party, in contrast to what we just talked about in the previous project, where we were focusing on evaluation by group members who you can think of as second party, because these are people who are directly affected by the actions of the decision maker. So why is third-party evaluation useful and important? Because if only second parties could impose sanctions, then a limited number of norms could only be enforced, because many norm violations are not going to actually directly hurt other people. So it's basically unaffected third parties because they're willing to incur a cost to sanction decision makers who can help enforce social norms. And authors such as Furr and Fischbacher, in fact, argue that sanctions by third parties would reveal truly normative standards of behavior. Because if you think about the actions of second parties, they could have other strategic motives as well. So their motive might not be always to uphold the norm. It might be to retaliate or to reciprocate in other ways, exactly as we saw in the previous project. Right? So third-party sanctions are seen to be universal across cultures. In a really nice paper in Science, Henrik et al. Show that third-party evaluation and punishments are observed in many different societies around the world. And they're also observed through time. Economic historians such as Avner Graef have shown that Maghreb merchant guilds in the 11th century were very much responsible for upholding trading norms. So they made sure that complex trade could be conducted, even though there were not many fully enforceable legal contracts for trade. And they did this by making sure that traders in different parts of the region honored their trading commitments. So what we do in this paper is we ask if male and female third parties evaluate actions of men and women differently, and do these evaluations vary in different social environments. We use lab in the field experiments. We have a simple experiment where decision makers have to choose how money is divided, and there is a third party who evaluates the choice made and can then decide whether to punish the decision maker for violating the equal distribution norm. So some more details about the actual experiment. We have 3 players. We have a proposer, a receiver, and a judge. The proposer and receiver participate in a standard dictator game where the proposer is endowed with a certain amount of money and has 3 options: an equal split option, a generous option, or a selfish option. And we are going to be focusing on the selfish option, obviously, because we are looking at transgressions. Judge is endowed with a certain amount of money again and has the option to punish the proposer. This is costly punishment. So if they choose to punish by 1 unit, then the proposer's earnings are going to go down by 3 units. Okay. We have, in each session, we have a certain number of participants, 24 in this case, equal number of men and women, and the decisions of the judge are made using the strategy method, which in this case means that they respond to each of the 3 options that the proposer could have chosen. The receivers indicate their beliefs about the choices that are being made by the proposers and the judges. So simultaneously, while the judges and the proposers are making their decisions, the receivers are indicating what their beliefs are about these decisions. We have a gender revealed and a gender not revealed treatment. Gender revealed is where the judges know the gender of the proposer and of the receiver. So as I said, we're going to focus on punishments by the judge in response to proposers making a selfish offer, because the research question relates to the transgression story. We have data from 960 subjects, and they were paid 362 rupees on average. Okay, so in this game, the proposers and the receivers are paired anonymously, and they receive their role just randomly. There is no particular, they're just randomly assigned to these roles. So in this sense, the norm here should be of equal distribution, because there's no good reason why the proposer should walk out with more money as compared to the receiver, right? And if that is so, if the salient norm in this case is of equal distribution, the question is, would the judges punish the proposers for violating this norm? Now, as we know from years of standard theory, if it is costly for judges to punish, and if judges only care about their own payoffs, then we should not observe any punishment. And if other players believe that the judges are selfish, and if they think that this norm is not very salient of equal distribution, then receivers also expect that the judges are not going to be punished, regardless of how the proposers act, so which option the proposers choose. So we should be not expecting to see much punishment, and receivers also should not be thinking that there will be any punishment. Okay. However, years of now 3 decades maybe of social preference theories and evidence from experiments has shown that people don't just care about their monetary preferences, they also sometimes care about other people. And so from that, we should be expecting that judges will punish, right? The interesting question for us here is, are there gender differences in these punishment patterns, and what is the role of the prevailing social environment? So let me tell you a bit about the social environment. So the first experiment that we conduct is in the East Khasi Hills district in the state of Meghalaya in India, and this is the home to matrilineal societies. So that's this part here. And this is actually quite a useful setting, because there is observed to be less gender bias in this area along many different dimensions. For example, Alice Evans and many other researchers have shown that women in the state would be more likely to reach infancy, survive infancy. They're more likely to be educated. They are more likely to own assets. They're more likely to work alongside men, and along many different dimensions, they seem to be more equal. Okay, so this map shows the gender sex ratio, which is the indicator of surviving infancy. So this is for children between 0 and 6. And what you find here is that Meghalaya is a state where you have the most equal ratio. So that's the darkest part of the map here. So for every 1,000 boys, 970 girls survive infancy. So this has been an area which has attracted researchers, not just economists, but also sociologists and political scientists. So there's been quite a bit of work which has been done using data from this area, not just experiments, but also observational data. So what we did was we went to 20 villages and we conduct one session in each village, and we have both gender revealed and gender not revealed sessions, obviously. So what do we find? So let me show you, these are basically results from regressions, and these are difference estimates from regressions. And the first result I'm going to show you is going to look at the comparison between male proposers and female proposers. So how are they being evaluated, and how are they being evaluated by male judges versus female judges? So the male versus female proposers are on the y-axis of this graph. And if you have these bars close to 0, then that means that there is no differential evaluation. But here what we can see is that there is a gender gap in being punished. So male proposers are being punished more as compared to female proposers, and this is being driven by the male judges. For female judges, they're very close to the 0. That means they're being evaluated similarly in this case. Okay. Now let's look at the difference between female judges and male judges. So that's what we have on the y-axis now. And what we find here is that female judges punish female proposers 15.3 percentage points more than male judges. So that's this one here. Okay, so here this is not statistically significant. So just a quick summary then, what we find is that both male and female judges are punishing, but they're punishing different people. So the male judges are punishing males and female judges are punishing females. Okay. Now let me show you some results from the second experiment that we conducted. So this was conducted in the state of Haryana, which is characterized by strong patriarchal norms, and there is a strong gender bias against women. So this is this part of the map. And here, using the same map, which is indicating the child sex ratio, you can see that Haryana is actually one of the worst performers. So for every 1,000 boys, just about 830 girls survive in fencing. We use same procedures, same instructions, everything is similar across the two experiments. And what do we find? So let me start again with a male versus female proposer. And what we find here is that the gender gap in being punished by male judges is pretty high. So it's the women who are being punished much more in this experiment. And female proposers are more likely to be punished by male judges as compared to female judges. Okay, so that's this one here. So in both cases, basically what we're seeing is that female proposers are being punished in experiment 2, and they're being punished by men. Okay? So to bring these results together and to think a bit more clearly about them, we consider a very simple framework. So we have our proposer who draws utility from basically their own payoffs and from maybe sharing some of the payoffs with the receiver. And we have a receiver who draws the utility just from their own payoffs because they don't really have any other action in this case. Now, the proposer may also expect to be punished by the judge. So that also gets accounted for in their decision making. Okay, so that's the amount that they keep, that's the amount they give to the receiver, and that's the amount they may be potentially punished by the judge. What does the judge do? The judge in this case is going to decide on whether they want to punish or not. And their utility depends on, of course, their own payoffs, but also from the payoff that they get from enforcing norms. Okay, so that's the utility they get from their own payoffs, and this is the utility that they may get from enforcing social norms. So they may choose to punish to express disapproval for a violation of norm S in society S. So punishment in situations where norms are strong might be greater than equal to punishment if norms are weak. Okay? So let's see what we find in terms of norms in our experiments. We have some data from the receivers, and we can see that our receivers thought that in experiment 1, the receivers thought that the proposer would be most likely to be fair. Okay, so that's a modal norm in experiment 1. And they also expect that the judge is going to punish if the proposer offers a selfish option. Now let's see what happens in experiment 2. In experiment 2, again, the expected proposer offer is being fair is a modal offer. But in the case of the judge's decision, it's not very clear now. So it's a bit murky. So now receivers here are expecting that they might be punished, or that the proposers are going to be punished by the judges or rewarded by the judges, right? So this is equally likely in this case. So it's not very clear what they think would happen in experiment 2. So in experiment 2, the norms seem to be not very clear. Now let's look next at the actual behavior. So we have obviously the actual punishment behavior by the judges. So that's in brown here, and in gray is what the receivers think will happen in terms of punishment. And you can see that the actual punishment seems to be very consistent with expectations in each of the experimental settings. But you can also see that the levels are quite different. So the social norms seem to be much stronger in this case, and you can see that the punishment is much stronger, just like our framework suggested that the punishment is going to be stronger in situations where you have stronger norms as compared to weaker norms. So you can think of this is a third-party punishment, and you can think of this as the reflection of the second party. What do the second party, the party that is actually harmed by this action, what do they think should happen? Okay, so that's the comparison between second and third party in some sense. Okay, so what we found here is that the social environment can be critical in how men and women are being evaluated for transgressing norms. In experiment 1, we have an environment with less gender biases, and we found that both male and female decision makers are punished. Men sanction men more, and women sanction women. In an environment where we have significant gender biases, which is experiment 2 here, we observe a gender punishment gap. Female decision makers get punished disproportionately more than male decision makers for exactly the same transgression. And this is driven by male evaluators. So female evaluators are not really punishing much in this environment. In both environments, what we find is that female evaluators reduce the gender punishment gap. And they do this in two ways. Firstly, by punishing less, so the levels are much less. And secondly, they punish in the direction opposite to what the male evaluator does. So let me just circle back in closing on this project to the literature on differential punishment of labor market outcomes. So Egan et al., which is one of the papers we talked about early on, which found that female financial advisors were more likely to be fired after a misconduct as compared to males. So their paper also has a setup where there is no uncertainty, similar to the second project here that we discussed. And the cause for punishment is very clear. So these are all people who have done something which is not acceptable. But in this case, what they are looking at second party punishment, because it's managers who are punishing the financial advisors. Whereas in our case, we're focusing on third party punishment, in particular in the case of non-transgressions in weak and strong norm environments. And in doing so, we hope to be able to understand the behavioral foundations of third-party punishment better, particularly in the context of gender. So what we found across both the projects is that women may be evaluated differently from men, and this could be due to biases in information updating. It could be due to different weights which are put on outcomes versus beliefs, or it could be due to the social environment. Now, many policy interventions have been proposed to reduce gender discrimination, and many of them target at changing women's preferences. Women are encouraged to be less risk averse, they're encouraged to be more competitive, more confident, etc. Right? But while these are all useful measures and useful approaches to think of, the point is that many of these interventions, by focusing just on preferences, may be neglecting the other side of the problem, which is that women might not be successful in decision-making positions, or may not want to get into decision-making positions because of the biased evaluations against them. Several open questions arise from the research that we talked about today. In both the projects, and particularly in the first one, we were looking at a situation where decision-making involves altruism in some sense, right? So, but what about situations where decision-making involves ability or skill, and if these skills require tasks that are gender congruent, which is either corresponding to gender stereotypes or counter to gender stereotypes. So what kind of biases would emerge in that case? That would be interesting to study. We talked about understanding gender norms, but also it will be useful to think about different ways of changing gender norms. And already there are some papers which try and look at how to do this. And these seem to be fruitful avenues for future research. For example, Dhar et al. Find that in the context of India, the gender norms of adolescents can be changed after they participate in a 2-year school program. Also, in the context of Saudi Arabia, Bernstein et al. Find that the norms of married men about their wives' labor supply can be changed by giving them information about what other men think. Changing institutional structures, another way to reduce gender discrimination. And one of the ways this has been done so far has been to try and have exogenous policy pushes, for example, affirmative action, to try and have women in decision-making roles, so that once people start seeing them in decision-making roles, then the biases against them are going to be reduced over time. Affirmative action, as we all know, has had mixed success. So in some cases, it has been very successful, but in others, it has been less successful. In some work that I have done with Tarun, Pushkar, and Joe, we found that actually in the short run, at least, we can see some backlash where people might act against these female leaders because of the fact that they have become leaders using this affirmative action policy. Beeman et al. Do find that attitudes change when you have female leaders in these positions. The other way to think about the institutional structure is to have a structure where norms per se would just have a less role to play. And in work that I've done with Nishwan, Urkel, and Urta Shah, what we found was that by changing the default from an opt-in to an opt-out can mean that more women participate in leadership positions, because now they don't have to go against the norm of male leadership in some sense to be able to participate in these kind of positions. So these might be areas for further research, and these are the ideas that I have been curious about and I have worked on with my co-authors. But of course, there might be new ideas that you're interested in, and I'm excited to hear those ideas. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me.
Thank you so much, Lasa, for the wonderful presentation. Let's see if there's any question from the audience. Anyone typing in any question? Because if they don't, I actually have kind of some food for thoughts, and I'm probably going to push you outside of what you have presented a little bit. Thinking about a conversation we had yesterday in one of the networking sessions. Wait, there is a question by Rebecca. Let's give Rebecca a chance to ask her question, and then I can go back to what I was trying to say. Social norms play a significant role in many of the biased outcomes for women. Changing these norms can take generations. Do you think quotas requiring 50% women in positions of power will fast-track this change?
So as I mentioned, I think quotas have an important role to play, and we see this across the world now. It's being used in many different countries. And of course, what we have to remember is that because it's a policy that is imposed on people, it can also lead to other kinds of perverse effects. And as I've just mentioned in my last slide, at least in some work that we had done in the context of quotas that were imposed in India, we found that there was a backlash against women who were elected because of these quotas. And we could deduce that because we used this natural policy experiment where women in Indian villages were, the head of the council was a woman because of the fact that only women were allowed to enter into election competition in that particular year, right? But it was randomly assigned. So it is a nice natural experiment for researchers, and there's been a lot of work on that. And a lot of the work on that, I think, shows, using the observational data shows that there are some positive impacts. The results are mixed, but there are also some positive impacts that are reported in the literature. there is not a lot of work on the behavioral impacts, which is what our work had focused on, and what we found, at least in the short run, there is a bit of a backlash. But definitely, quotas is part of the policy mix, I think. And what quotas can do is to improve the role model effect, because if you don't see people in these positions, then you can never change your biases, right? You can't really change your views about what women can do. So definitely it has a role model effect, and that should not be ignored, though one should be careful while implementing this in practice.
I think you might have just answered Alan Duncan's question on this. What strategies or programs do you think might work in practical business or institutional settings to remove the unconscious biases or subjective priors that decision makers appear to bring into decisions or performance evaluations?
Yes, so I think quotas and the role model effect is obviously useful, but I would also like to add that maybe having a bit more structured approach can be useful to reduce biases. And there is work that Iris Bonet and others have done to try and unpack this, and how organizations can change their hiring practices to try and understand how unconscious biases can creep in. So if you are, so I think many hiring panels are now trying to ask the same questions to all the candidates, rather than mixing and matching or just thinking of impromptu questions, because the idea is that when you see a male candidate, you may ask different kinds of questions, and when you see a female candidate, you ask different questions, just naturally, because that's how your brain works. But then that also means that they have less of an opportunity to provide the right response, which might then get them the job or not, right? So by asking the same questions, you're leveling the playing field, and you're making it a bit more structured, which people, because they're not used to, might find uncomfortable, but it might be a good approach, because that means that you reduce the scope for biases to creep in.
And I think that also plays an important role in, the illusion that we have about meritocracy is a concept that everyone uses, but it's one very difficult to achieve. And having these structures, bring the evaluation being more objective, as you.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
I think we only have 2 minutes, and I'm conscious we're gonna be dragged into the networking sessions. I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm sure also the other participants have. We will probably hear about this as we move into the lobby. I would like to thank you again for accepting our invitation, and I would like to share one career tip that you shared with me that I forgot to mention when I introduced you. So Lata said something very, very nice. Do not spend too much time concentrating on box ticking exercises, and concentrate your effort on finding creative ways to answer your research questions. And clearly she has shown wonderful ways of doing that throughout this presentation. Thank you again, Lata.
Thank you, Dina.